Welcome to NC Spin Perspectives, opinions from thought leaders in North Carolina. Today we're talking with Dr. Andy Taylor, who is a professor and head of the Political Science Department at North Carolina State University. We can't conclude an interview with you without talking about the election laws. We know that in Winston-Salem recently there's been hearings taking place, federal judge hearing the North Carolina election laws. The Republican-controlled legislature passed a number of changes to our laws, most of which will not really take effect until 2016. What's your opinion of these laws?
In general?
In general,
yeah. It was a very large...
I mean, there are a lot of people who are saying that what they did was discriminated against a class of people or a...
So you're specifically talking about the voter identification?
Well, voter identification as well as the length of time for early voting.
Yeah.
And
well, you know, as a political scientist, you often have a look at these things through the perspective of interest, right? And so a cynical way would be saying, yes, of course, Republicans, whether they could be wrong in this assumption, are thinking that this would help them electorally. And of course, it's an issue that Democrats are upset about because they believe that it will hurt them electorally as well. And so a sort of cynical understanding of human nature is that it's done for self-interest. Of course, there's also a sort of legal and constitutional issue involved. And as you said, the constitutional issue against the photo ID is that it disproportionately hurts particular groups among the electorate, who of course happen to generally vote Democratic, which is where the self-interested argument on each side comes. Whereas the other argument is that it is blind in every kind of dimension. It may be considered a barrier to voting, a slight barrier to voting, but there are, you know, to overcome constitutional arguments about poll taxes and etc. There is a free identification provision involved. That it is no more of a hindrance than the significant hindrances some people would say we already have in place, such as registration requirements and things like that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, going to be very interesting to see how it plays out in the courts. United States Supreme Court has already sort of allowed voter photo identification legislation in Indiana, but I think some people are sensing that there may be a reassessment of that position. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens through the courts.
some of these early provisions have already gone into effect and started with the May primaries this year. Now, the proponents of these new election laws say, hey, wait a minute, we had a higher percentage of minority voting in the May primaries than we had in 2010 in the off-year elections. It can't be a discriminatory process.
Well, but the real test will be 2016, of course, when everything's in place. But so it's interesting. A lot of the research shows that there hadn't been, at least prior to these recent changes, when Indiana and Georgia were really the only states in the middle part of last decade that had them. And so from like 2006 to 2010, those two states were the basic testing ground. And of course, and a lot of the data showed precisely that there wasn't any effect on turnout. So the question is, if you believe these are bad laws and they're discriminatory, you've got a small n. Right, you've got hardly any cases to derive.
Well, you've got
from.
two different stories going on here. The Republicans say, wait a minute, for 100 years, the Democrats were in charge of North Carolina, and they passed election laws which they felt were going to benefit their constituencies.
Yeah.
Now we are in charge, and we are passing laws which we feel like will benefit our party and our constituencies better. Isn't that essentially what's going on here? Is how you view this?
Yeah, well, and of course, I think people people on both sides of the aisle buy that on issues like the separate vote for president and partisan judicial elections. And it's pretty clear that the Democrats set it up those ways in order to benefit Democratic candidates, and Republicans are reversing it because they agreed with them. They did benefit Democratic candidates. Although, again, they're empirical questions, but I think most people believe that was the case. The reason why I think voter ID is such a big issue is because there are a lot of people who believe there are important constitutional issues on both sides. and I think that's and that's what the voter cares about. I mean, even a lot of voters say, well, let the two political parties fight it out. I don't care, you know, who wins, but I do care if you mess with my ability to vote, and on both sides, right? So on the Democratic side, it's a question of some people believing that there'll be higher obstacles to them voting. On the Republican side, that people believing that there is material voter fraud, and that, of course, in turn is disenfranchising certain people. That's why, you know, I think voter ID is so visceral to the average person. A lot of the other parts of that wide sweeping election law that we've been talking about are sort of inside baseball too.
Thank you, Andy Taylor.